The K-129 was a diesel-electric submarine armed with 3 nuclear warheads when it sank in March 1968. Neither the Soviet Union nor the United States publicly acknowledged what happened, but CIA documents, declassified sonar recordings, and fragments recovered from 3 miles down reveal a covert race. One superpower searching blindly, the other watching from the shadows and planning an impossible theft. The Allied convoys sailed in formations designed for mutual protection, with destroyers and corvettes patrolling the perimeter while cargo ships steamed in tight columns. But the wolf packs waited in the darkness, coordinating their attacks through radio communications that Allied intelligence was only beginning to intercept and decrypt. The U-boats would surface at night when visibility was poor, and their low profiles made them nearly invisible against the black water, and they would race ahead of the convoy on diesel engines faster than the merchant ships could travel, and then submerge before dawn, waiting for the convoy to pass overhead before rising to periscope depth and firing spreads of torpedoes into the unprotected flanks of the formation. Explosions would light up the night as fuel oil ignited and ships broke apart, spilling men and cargo into the freezing Atlantic, and the convoy would scatter in panic while escorts raced to locate the attackers, dropping depth charges that sometimes hit their targets, but more often exploded harmlessly in empty water while the U-boats slipped away to reload and attack again. The statistics were staggering and terrifying, as merchant ship losses mounted faster than shipyards could replace them, and Britain's reserves of food and fuel dwindled toward critical levels, and military planners began calculating how long the island nation could survive if the sinkings continued at current rates. The answer was measured in months, not years, and Winston Churchill would later write that the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war was the U-boat peril, because while armies could be rebuilt and cities reconstructed, a nation that starved would simply cease to exist. But the Allies were learning and adapting, developing new technologies and tactics to counter the submarine threat, and one of the most important was radar, which could detect surfaced U-boats at night when they were previously invisible, and force them to remain submerged, where their speed was reduced to a crawl and their battery power limited. Aircraft equipped with radar and depth charges began patrolling the mid-Atlantic gap, where land-based planes could not reach, and U-boats that had once operated with relative impunity now faced attack from above, as well as from surface escorts. Convoy procedures improved, with better coordination between merchant ships and naval escorts, and the introduction of escort carriers that brought air power directly to the convoys, and sonar technology advanced, allowing destroyers to track submerged submarines with increasing accuracy. Most critically, Allied intelligence achieved a breakthrough that would change the course of the entire Battle of the Atlantic, when cryptographers at Bletchley Park in England succeeded in breaking the German Enigma code that encrypted U-boat communications, and suddenly the Allies could read German naval messages almost in real time, learning where wolf packs were gathering and routing convoys around the danger zone. The Germans never realized their codes had been broken, and they continued transmitting patrol positions and attack coordinates directly to Allied intelligence officers who used the information to devastating effect. And by mid-1943, the tide had turned decisively against the U-boats. In May 1943 alone, 41 U-boats were sunk, while they managed to sink only 50 Allied ships, and Admiral Dönitz realized his submarine force was being destroyed faster than new boats could be built, and new crews trained, and on May 24th, he withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic, temporarily conceding defeat in the campaign that had nearly brought Britain to her knees. The U-boats never recovered from this setback, and while they continued fighting until the last days of the war, they never again posed an existential threat to Allied supply lines, and by the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Kriegsmarine had lost 783 U-boats, and approximately 28,000 submariners, making the U-boat service one of the most dangerous military assignments of the entire war, with a casualty rate exceeding 70%. The men who served in U-boats knew the odds and accepted them, volunteering for duty that would likely end in death by drowning or depth charge or suffocation in a crippled submarine lying on the ocean floor, and their sacrifice on both sides of the conflict was immense, as merchant sailors also died by the thousands torpedoed in the cold Atlantic, far from home, with little chance of rescue in waters that would kill from hypothermia within minutes. The Battle of the Atlantic claimed approximately 72,000 Allied sailors and 3,000 German submariners, and when the war ended, the ocean floor was littered with hundreds of wrecked ships and submarines, each one a tomb for the men who had sailed aboard her, and the lessons learned from this savage campaign would shape naval warfare for generations to come. Meanwhile, in the Pacific Ocean, another submarine war was unfolding with very different characteristics and outcomes as the United States Navy deployed its fleet boats against Japanese shipping in a campaign that would ultimately strangle Japan's war economy and contribute significantly to Allied victory. American submarines operated under different conditions than their German counterparts, facing vast distances between bases and patrol areas, and an enemy whose merchant marine was poorly organized and inadequately protected. And unlike the Germans who prioritized attacks on military targets early in the war, American submarines from the beginning focused on destroying Japan's merchant fleet, cutting off the flow of oil, rubber, and raw materials that the Japanese Empire needed to sustain its war effort. The campaign started slowly, with mechanical problems plaguing American torpedoes, which frequently failed to detonate or ran at incorrect depths, and frustrated submarine captains reported firing perfect shots only to watch torpedoes pass harmlessly beneath enemy hulls or strike targets without exploding. And it took nearly 2 years for the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance to acknowledge the defects and implement corrections. But once the torpedo problems were solved, American submarines became devastatingly effective. Japanese anti-submarine warfare was primitive compared to German capabilities with inadequate sonar, poor tactical doctrine, and a cultural emphasis on offensive operations that left defensive convoy protection understaffed and undervalued, and Japanese merchant ships often sailed alone or in small groups with minimal escort, making them easy targets for prowling American submarine. The numbers tell the story, as American submarines sank 1,178 Japanese merchant ships, totaling approximately 5 million tons, which represented more than 60% of Japan's total merchant marine. And additionally, they sank 214 Japanese naval vessels, including a battleship and 8 aircraft carriers. And by 1945, Japan's economy was in collapse, with factories shutting down for lack of raw materials and civilians facing starvation as food shipments from occupied territories were cut off. The cost to American submariners was significant, but nowhere near the catastrophic losses suffered by German U-boat crews, as the United States lost 52 submarines and approximately 3,500 men during the Pacific Campaign, a casualty rate of about 22%, which, while substantial, was far lower than the 70% suffered by German submariners. The difference reflected both superior American submarine technology and the relative weakness of Japanese anti-submarine forces. But it also demonstrated that submarines, when properly employed and supported, could be war-winning weapons rather than merely commerce raiders, and the success of the American submarine campaign in the Pacific validated the enormous investment the Navy had made in submarine development during the interwar years. As World War II ended in August 1945, with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan's subsequent surrender, submarine technology stood at a crossroads, because the diesel-electric submarines that had dominated the war were inherently limited by their need to surface frequently to recharge batteries and run diesel engines, which made them vulnerable to detection and attack. And true submarines that could remain submerged indefinitely operating independently of the surface remained a technological dream rather than reality. But even as the war ended, German engineers had been working on revolutionary submarine designs that would transform underwater warfare, and among the most significant was the Type 81 U-boat, which incorporated a streamlined hull designed for underwater speed rather than surface performance, along with vastly improved battery capacity that allowed sustained high-speed submerged operations and schnorkel systems that permitted diesel engine operation while submerged at periscope depth. Only a handful of Type 21 boats became operational before Germany surrendered, but their design influenced all subsequent submarine development. And when Allied naval officers examined captured Type 21 submarines after the war, they realized that German engineers had created something genuinely revolutionary that made all existing submarines obsolete. The United States and Soviet Union both seized German submarine technology along with German engineers and scientists and began incorporating these advances into their own programs, and the stage was set for the next evolution in submarine warfare, which would be driven by an even more transformative technology that German scientists had been unable to perfect. But American and Soviet engineers would successfully develop. Nuclear power changed everything because a nuclear reactor, unlike a diesel engine, requires no oxygen and produces no exhaust, which meant a nuclear-powered submarine could remain submerged, indefinitely limited only by crew endurance and food supplies, and could travel at high speeds underwater without draining batteries. And the strategic implications were profound, as nuclear submarines could transit oceans submerged and undetected, station themselves off enemy coasts for months at a time, and carry ballistic missiles armed with nuclear warheads, creating an invulnerable second strike capability that would become central to Cold War deterrence strategy. The United States Navy launched the first nuclear-powered submarine USS Nautilus in January 1954, under the leadership of Admiral Hyman Rickover, who had driven the nuclear propulsion program forward despite bureaucratic resistance and technical challenges. And the Nautilus proved the concept immediately by traveling submerged from Pearl Harbor to the East Coast. And in August 1958, she became the first submarine to reach the North Pole, traveling beneath the Arctic ice cap in a feat that would have been impossible for any diesel-electric submarine. The Soviet Union followed quickly, launching their first nuclear submarine, K-3, in 1958, and beginning a submarine construction program that would eventually produce the largest underwater fleet in history. And the arms race was on, as both superpowers invested billions in developing increasingly sophisticated nuclear submarines optimized for different missions, from attack submarines designed to hunt other submarines to ballistic missile submarines that carried enough nuclear firepower to destroy civilization. The submarines of the Cold War were technological marvels, far removed from the primitive boats that had fought in World War II, as they incorporated advanced sonar systems that could detect targets hundreds of miles away, computer-controlled fire control systems that calculated torpedo trajectories, automatically nuclear reactors that could operate for decades without refueling, and hulls constructed from specialized steel alloys capable of diving to depths exceeding 1,000 feet, where water pressure would crush conventional submarines like tin cans. They were also extraordinarily expensive, with a single modern nuclear submarine costing billions of dollars, requiring years to construct, and demanding crew training programs that transformed ordinary sailors into technical specialists capable of operating equipment more complex than most surface ships. And the men who served aboard them faced unique challenges living in confined spaces for months at a time, isolated from families and sunlight and fresh air, operating in an environment where a single mechanical failure or human error could result in catastrophic disaster. The Cold War submarine service attracted a particular type of individual who could tolerate isolation and confinement, who possessed the technical aptitude to master complex systems, and who accepted the risks inherent in operating nuclear reactors and high-pressure hulls in the hostile environment of the deep ocean. And these men formed tight-knit communities bound by shared danger and mutual dependence because in a submarine hundreds of feet below the surface, every crew member's life depended on every other crew member's competence and reliability. This was the world into which USS Scorpion sailed in 1968, as one boat among dozens in the American nuclear submarine fleet, tasked with missions that ranged from intelligence gathering to tracking Soviet submarines to maintaining readiness for nuclear war. And she was a skipjack-class attack submarine commissioned in 1960, displacing 30,500 tons with a crew of 99, and capable of diving to 700 feet, and traveling at speeds exceeding 30 knots, submerged, and like all submarines, she was a complex machine dependent on hundreds of interconnected systems, any one of which could fail with potentially fatal consequences. The Scorpion's final days remain shrouded in mystery and contradictory evidence as the submarine navigated the Atlantic waters on her homeward journey after months of deployment, and the crew performed their duties with practiced efficiency, unaware that they were sailing toward disaster. Communication logs show routine transmissions on May 21st, indicating normal operations with no distress signals or technical problems reported, and the submarine was traveling at standard cruising speed on a direct course for Norfolk, where families waited with growing anticipation for the reunion that would never come. Naval records suggest the Scorpion may have been diverted from her planned route to investigate Soviet naval activity in the area, as tensions between American and Soviet forces remained high throughout 1968, and submarines frequently received orders to monitor or shadow enemy vessels that appeared in their operational zones. Some analysts believe the Scorpion was tasked with observing a Soviet submarine or surface group that intelligence had detected in the eastern Atlantic, and this potential diversion may have placed her in waters where the ocean floor dropped to depths exceeding 1,000 feet, creating conditions where any catastrophic failure would prove instantly fatal. The submarine's maintenance history reveals she had experienced mechanical problems during her deployment, including issues with hydraulic systems and torpedo mechanisms, and some crew members had reported concerns about equipment reliability in letters home, though such complaints were common among submariners operating vessels that spent months at sea under extreme conditions. On May 22nd, at approximately 1842, Greenwich Mean Time, underwater hydrophones belonging to the Navy's classified sound surveillance system detected acoustic signals consistent with a submarine hull implosion southwest of the Azores at coordinates that would later prove critical to the search effort. The hydrophone network had been installed on ocean floors around the world, specifically to track Soviet submarine movements, but it recorded American submarine activity as well, and the acoustic signature detected that evening matched the frequency and intensity patterns associated with catastrophic structural failure at depth. Multiple hydrophone stations recorded the event, allowing Navy analysts to triangulate the source location with reasonable accuracy. But the information remained classified, and families waiting at Norfolk were told nothing as hours turned to days without word from the Scorpion. On May 27th, when the submarine failed to arrive at Naval Station Norfolk on schedule, Navy officials initially maintained public calm, suggesting the delay might result from communication difficulties or weather conditions, but internally, alarm bells were ringing as emergency protocols activated and search operations began organizing. The families gathered at the pier holding welcome home signs, and wearing their best clothes stood in growing confusion as naval officers deflected questions and promised updates that never came. And as hours passed without explanation, confusion turned to fear, and fear to dread. By May 28th, the Navy officially declared the Scorpion overdue and presumed missing, initiating the largest submarine search operation in American history, as dozens of ships and aircraft deployed across the Atlantic, following her projected course and scanning thousands of square miles of empty ocean. The vastness of the search area presented staggering challenges, as the Atlantic Ocean covers more than 41 million square miles, and a submarine lying on the ocean floor becomes essentially invisible to conventional search methods, especially at depths where sunlight cannot penetrate, and sonar returns become confused by temperature layers and bottom terrain. Search aircraft flew grid patterns over the projected route, dropping sonar buoys and scanning for any surface debris that might indicate a sinking, but the ocean surface revealed nothing, as weeks passed without discovering oil slicks wreckage or life rafts. Surface ships crisscrossed the search zone, towing sonar arrays and magnetic detection equipment attempting to locate the submarine's steel hull against the background noise of undersea geology. But the technology of 1968 was primitive by modern standards, and searching for a submarine in deep water remained an extraordinarily difficult task. Meanwhile, Navy investigators began analyzing the classified acoustic data from the hydrophone network, and the triangulated position southwest of the Azores became the focus of intensive study, as analysts calculated that if the acoustic signals represented the Scorpion's destruction, she would be lying in approximately 11,000 feet of water, far beyond the reach of any salvage equipment, and deeper than most ocean exploration vehicles could dive. The families endured agonizing uncertainty as Navy officials released minimal information, citing operational security and ongoing investigation, while privately admirals and intelligence officers reviewed every possible scenario, from mechanical failure to enemy action to sabotage. Some intelligence analysts suggested the Scorpion might have been attacked by Soviet submarines in retaliation for American naval operations against Soviet vessels, but no evidence supported this theory, and Soviet submarine movements tracked during the period showed no hostile activity in the area where the Scorpion disappeared. Others proposed that the submarine had suffered a torpedo malfunction, as the Mark 37 torpedoes carried by American submarines were known to have faulty batteries that could overheat and potentially detonate inside the torpedo room, creating an explosion that would destroy the entire forward section and send the submarine plunging to the ocean floor. Still, other investigators focused on the possibility of reactor problems or steam system failures that could have caused flooding or loss of propulsion, leading to an uncontrolled dive past the submarine's crush depth where water pressure would implode the hull like a tin can. In October 1968, after months of fruitless searching, the Navy deployed the research vessel Mizar, equipped with specialized deep-sea camera equipment, to photograph the ocean floor in the area where hydrophones had detected the implosion, and the tedious work of dragging camera sleds across the abyssal plain began with each pass covering only a narrow strip of seafloor at depths where total darkness prevailed, except for the camera's floodlights. The search continued for weeks as the Mizar methodically photographed grid after grid, finding nothing but mud and rock and the occasional deep-sea creature adapted to the crushing pressure and near-freezing temperatures. And then on October 28th, the cameras captured images of debris scattered across the sea floor. The photographs showed twisted metal and recognizable submarine components, including sections of hull marked with numbers that identified them as belonging to the Scorpion, and as more photographs were taken, the full extent of the disaster became apparent. The submarine had broken into two main sections, with the forward compartments, including the torpedo room, and crew berthing separated from the reactor section and stern, and both sections showed evidence of catastrophic implosion, as water pressure had crushed the hull like an eggshell. Equipment and debris were scattered across hundreds of feet of ocean floor, and analysis of the wreckage distribution pattern suggested the submarine had been traveling at high speed when disaster struck, as components had been thrown forward by the vessel's momentum during the breakup. The conning tower and sail had been ripped away from the main hull and lay tilted at an angle nearby, and the reactor compartment, though severely damaged, remained relatively intact, suggesting the nuclear reactor had shut down before the final destruction. Inside the wreckage, entombed in darkness and beyond any possibility of recovery, lay the bodies of 99 men who had died instantly when the hull imploded, or who had survived in air pockets for hours or days waiting for rescue that could never reach them at such depths. The Navy convened a court of inquiry to investigate the loss, examining every piece of available evidence from maintenance records to crew personnel files to the acoustic data to the photographs of the wreckage. But despite months of investigation, the exact cause of the sinking could not be determined with certainty. The court concluded that the most probable cause was an explosion, possibly from a torpedo malfunction that had flooded the forward compartments and sent the submarine into an uncontrolled dive past her crush depth. But this remained speculation rather than proven fact, and classified portions of the investigation suggested other possibilities that were never made public. On December 30th, 1968, the Navy held a memorial service for the crew of USS Scorpion, as 99 names were read aloud and 99 families mourned, and the submarine was officially struck from the Naval Register, though her wreckage remains on the ocean floor to this day, serving as a tomb and a reminder of the risks that submariners accept every time they descend beneath the waves. The loss of the Scorpion, along with the earlier sinking of USS Thresher in 1963, which had killed 129 men during deep diving tests, prompted major safety overhauls across the submarine fleet as the Navy implemented new inspection procedures, emergency systems, and training protocols designed to prevent similar disasters. The SubSafe program established rigorous standards for submarine construction and maintenance, requiring extensive testing and certification of all systems critical to watertight integrity, and submarines built after the Thresher disaster incorporated improved emergency ballast blow systems, backup power supplies, and reinforced hull construction. Yet despite all safety improvements, submarines remained inherently dangerous, as they operated in an environment fundamentally hostile to human life, where a single mechanical failure or moment of human error could prove instantly fatal, and the ocean floor continued to claim victims from all nations operating submarine fleets. The Soviet Union suffered even greater losses, though many remained classified for decades, as the totalitarian government suppressed information about military disasters, and families of lost submariners were often told nothing except that their loved ones had died in service to the state. Soviet submarine K-8 sank in April 1970 after fires in two compartments filled the vessel with toxic smoke, and though the crew managed to surface and many escaped before she went down, 52 men died when the submarine lost buoyancy and sank in 15,000 feet of water in the Bay of Biscay. The submarine K-19 earned the nickname Hiroshima among Soviet submariners because of her history of accidents, beginning with a catastrophic reactor coolant failure in 1961 that exposed the crew to lethal radiation doses, killing 8 men immediately and condemning others to slow deaths from radiation sickness, and the submarine continued experiencing fires, explosions, and mechanical failures throughout her operational lifetime. In October 1986, the Soviet ballistic missile submarine K-219 suffered a missile tube rupture while on patrol in the Atlantic approximately 600 miles east of Bermuda, and seawater flooding into the tube reacted with residual rocket fuel, creating toxic gases that killed 3 sailors instantly. The captain surfaced the submarine and attempted damage control as the crew fought to contain the leak and prevent the fuel from igniting, which could have detonated the missile's nuclear warhead and caused a catastrophic explosion that might have triggered a military confrontation between the superpowers. Seaman Sergei Preminin volunteered to enter the flooded reactor compartment to manually shut down the nuclear reactors and prevent a meltdown, and he succeeded in the shutdown procedure, but became trapped when the hatch mechanism jammed, and he died alone in the radiation-contaminated compartment, having saved his submarine and possibly prevented a nuclear disaster. The K-219 remained afloat for 3 more days as Soviet ships attempted to take her under tow, but on October 6th, she lost her battle with the sea and sank into 18,000 feet of water where she rests today, with her nuclear reactors and missiles entombed on the ocean floor. These disasters and dozens of others demonstrated that submarine warfare remained extraordinarily dangerous, even decades after nuclear power had eliminated many of the limitations that plagued diesel-electric boats, and the men who volunteered for submarine duty understood they were accepting risks that exceeded those faced by most military personnel. The submarine service attracted a particular personality type, as individuals who suffered from claustrophobia, or who needed personal space, or who couldn't tolerate prolonged isolation, simply could not function in an environment where 100 men lived for months in a steel tube, measuring less than 300 feet long, with no privacy, no sunlight, no fresh air, and no escape if something went wrong. Submarine crews developed intense bonds forged by shared danger and mutual dependence because every man's life literally depended on every other man's competence and reliability, and a single sailor's mistake could kill everyone aboard. The training programs for submarine duty were rigorous and demanding, as candidates underwent months of technical education, learning to operate nuclear reactors, maintain life support systems, repair hydraulic mechanisms, and respond to emergency situations from fires to flooding to reactor failures, and those who couldn't master the material or who demonstrated poor judgment under pressure were removed from the program because the margin for error underwater was 0. Those who completed training and earned their dolphins, the insignia worn by qualified submariners, joined an elite fraternity that transcended national boundaries, as submariners from different nations recognized in each other the shared experience of descending into darkness and trusting your life to machinery and shipmates in an environment where rescue was often impossible. By the 1990s and 2000s, submarine technology had advanced to extraordinary levels as computer systems replaced manual controls, advanced materials allowed deeper diving depths, and improved sonar and quieting technologies made submarines nearly undetectable by enemy forces. American Virginia-class submarines incorporated stealth features that made them among the quietest vessels ever built, capable of approaching enemy coastlines undetected and conducting surveillance operations while remaining invisible to the most sophisticated detection equipment. Russian Yasen-class submarines matched American capabilities with comparable stealth systems, advanced weapons, and the ability to launch cruise missiles against land targets from submerged positions thousands of miles from their home ports, and the arms race that had begun decades earlier continued with both nations investing billions in developing ever more capable underwater platforms. China emerged as a major submarine power, building both nuclear attack submarines and ballistic missile submarines as part of a broader naval expansion program designed to project power throughout the Pacific and establish a credible nuclear deterrent capability, and by 2025, China operated more than 70 submarines, making it one of the largest submarine fleets in the world. Other nations, including Britain, France, India, and Pakistan, maintained their own submarine forces, ranging from a handful of vessels to several dozen, and even smaller nations sought to acquire submarine capabilities, recognizing that submarines provided asymmetric warfare advantages, allowing smaller navies to threaten much larger surface fleets. The submarine had evolved from an experimental curiosity in the early 1900s to the most powerful naval weapons system ever created, capable of remaining hidden for months at a time, traveling at high speeds underwater, and carrying enough nuclear firepower to devastate entire continents. And yet, despite all the technological advances, the fundamental nature of submarine warfare remained unchanged from the days of John Holland and the USS Holland. Submarines still descended into darkness, still operated in an environment where mechanical failure meant death, still depended on the skill and courage of their crews, and still occasionally vanished without warning, taking their crews to ocean floors where they would never be recovered. And the tradition of submariners as a breed apart from other sailors continued into the 21st century. The ocean surface stretched endlessly in all directions as families stood on the pier at Naval Station Norfolk on May 27, 1968, watching the horizon for a submarine that would never appear, and children dressed in their finest clothes held handmade welcome home signs, while wives adjusted their makeup one final time and parents clutched photographs of sons they hadn't seen in months. All of them scanning the harbor entrance for the familiar silhouette that should have broken the surface hours ago. Navy officials maintained calm, reassuring the waiting families that submarines sometimes ran late, and communications could be disrupted by weather or technical difficulties, and transit schedules were not always precise, so there was no immediate cause for alarm, and the families should remain patient and wait for further information. But as hours turned into evening, and the sun began setting over the Atlantic, the reassurances rang increasingly hollow. By nightfall, concern had transformed into alarm as Navy emergency procedures activated and officials began contacting all vessels in the Atlantic, checking recent radio traffic, and attempting to establish contact with the Scorpion through every available channel. But the ocean returned only silence, and on May 28th, the Navy officially declared the USS Scorpion overdue and presumed missing, initiating what would become one of the largest submarine search operations in American history. Dozens of ships and aircraft deployed across the Atlantic following the submarine's projected course and scanning thousands of square miles of empty ocean. But the vastness of the search area presented almost insurmountable challenges as the Atlantic Ocean covers more than 41 million square miles, and a submarine could be anywhere along a corridor hundreds of miles wide, stretching across thousands of miles of open water, and finding a single vessel in that immensity was like searching for a needle in a haystack the size of a continent. The situation grew even more dire when analysts calculated that if the Scorpion had sunk, she could be lying on the ocean floor at depths exceeding 1,000 feet, far deeper than most salvage equipment could reach, and far beyond the capabilities of any divers. And at such depths, recovery would be impossible, and the crew would remain entombed forever in their steel coffin, surrounded by crushing darkness and pressure that would preserve their bodies in the frigid water. The Navy deployed every available resource, flying search patterns over the projected route and dropping sonar buoys, while surface ships crisscrossed the search zone, towing detection equipment and scanning for any trace of wreckage or debris or oil slicks or life rafts. But weeks passed without discovering anything, and the ocean surface revealed no secrets, keeping whatever had happened to the Scorpion hidden beneath thousands of feet. Families waited at home, clinging to hope that perhaps the submarine had merely lost communications and was limping toward port on emergency power, or that the crew was alive somewhere waiting to be found. But as days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months, hope faded and was replaced by the awful certainty that their loved ones were gone and would never return, and the waiting transformed from anxious anticipation into endless mourning. The Navy's classified underwater surveillance network, designed primarily to track Soviet submarine movements, had recorded something unusual on May 22, 1968, when hydrophones installed on the ocean floor detected acoustic signals at 1842 Greenwich Mean Time, southwest of the Azores, and the signature was consistent with a submarine hull implosion, and Navy analysts began the painstaking work of triangulating the source using data from multiple hydrophone stations positioned across the Atlantic. The calculations indicated that the signals originated from a position approximately 400 miles southwest of the Azores, and if the Scorpion had imploded at that location, she would be lying on the abyssal plain, crushed and broken in near total darkness, where sunlight never penetrated, and temperatures hovered just above freezing, and pressure exceeded 4,800 pounds per square inch, enough to crush a human body instantly. The Navy possessed specialized equipment designed for deep ocean searches, and in October 1968, they dispatched the research vessel Mizar to the search area, equipped with a deep-sea camera sled that carried high-intensity lights and still cameras, and the sled was lowered to within a few meters of the ocean floor and dragged slowly across the search grid, photographing everything below in a tedious, exhausting process that moved at less than 1 knot and covered only narrow strips of seafloor, with each pass taking days to complete. The search continued for weeks, as the Mizar methodically photographed grid after grid, finding nothing but mud and rock and occasional deep-sea creatures adapted to the crushing pressure and perpetual darkness. But the search teams persisted, knowing that somewhere in the vastness below lay the answers to what had happened to the Scorpion and her crew. On October 28, 1968, after weeks of searching, the cameras finally captured something as debris appeared scattered across the ocean floor nearly 2 miles deep. And as more photographs were taken, the full extent of the disaster became apparent, and the shattered remains of a submarine emerged from the darkness, confirming what everyone had feared, but no one wanted to believe. The photographs revealed catastrophic destruction, as the Scorpion had broken into 2 main sections with the forward part of the submarine, including the torpedo room crew berthing and control room, separated from the reactor compartment and stern section, and the hull was crushed and imploded by water pressure, with pipes and cables dangling from torn metal and equipment scattered across hundreds of feet of seafloor. And the conning tower had been ripped away from the main hull and lay nearby, tilted at an angle. Inside that wreckage, entombed in darkness and beyond any possibility of recovery, lay the bodies of 99 men who had died either instantly when the hull imploded or who had survived in air pockets for hours or days, waiting for rescue that could never reach them at such depths. And the Navy faced the awful reality that they could not bring these men home, and their families would have no graves to visit and no bodies to bury. On December 30th, 1968, the Navy held a memorial service for the crew of the USS Scorpion, as 99 names were read aloud one by one, and 99 families mourned their losses, and the cause of the sinking remained officially undetermined and classified as unknown, though investigations continued in an attempt to understand what had happened in the submarine's final moments. The Navy convened a court of inquiry, assembling teams of experts who reviewed every piece of available evidence, from acoustic data to radio transmissions to maintenance records to crew personnel files to photographs of the wreckage to testimony from submariners and engineers, and they developed multiple theories attempting to explain the disaster. Some investigators believed the Scorpion had been attacked by a Soviet submarine sunk in retaliation for American intelligence operations against Soviet vessels, but analysis of the wreckage revealed no evidence of torpedo damage and no debris consistent with an external explosion. And Soviet submarine movements tracked during the period showed no hostile activity in the area where the Scorpion disappeared. Others suggested a torpedo malfunction, as the Scorpion carried Mark 37 torpedoes, and some of these weapons had faulty batteries known to overheat, and if a torpedo had activated inside the torpedo room and begun running its engine, it could have detonated, destroying the submarine from within and sending her plunging to the ocean floor. Still, other investigators focused on the possibility that the submarine had exceeded her safe diving depth during an emergency maneuver, perhaps, while attempting to avoid a collision or respond to flooding, and the hull had failed catastrophically when water pressure exceeded the structural limits of the steel. The court of inquiry concluded that the most likely cause was an internal explosion, possibly from a torpedo malfunction or a failure in the submarine's systems, but the exact sequence of events remained uncertain, and classified portions of the investigation suggested additional possibilities that were never released to the public, and families were left with questions that would never be fully answered. The Scorpion was not the first submarine to be lost in peacetime, and she would not be the last. As the history of submarine warfare is written in the names of vessels that vanished and men who never returned. And in April 1963, the USS Thresher had sunk during deep diving tests off the coast of Massachusetts, killing all 129 crew members and civilian technicians aboard. The investigation into the Thresher disaster revealed that a piping failure had flooded the engine room, causing the reactor to shut down, and without power, the submarine couldn't blow her ballast tanks quickly enough to surface, and she sank past her crush depth and imploded, killing everyone instantly, and the Navy recovered pieces of wreckage from 8,400 feet, but most of the submarine remains on the ocean floor to this day. New safety procedures were implemented across the submarine fleet following the Thresher loss, as the SubSafe program established rigorous standards for submarine construction and maintenance requiring extensive testing and certification of all systems critical to watertight integrity. But despite all improvements, submarines remained inherently dangerous, operating in an environment fundamentally hostile to human life. The Soviet Union suffered even greater losses, though many remained secret for decades, as the totalitarian government suppressed information about military disasters. And on April 8, 1970, the Soviet submarine K-8 suffered fires in 2 compartments while operating in the Bay of Biscay, and the crew fought the fires for hours, but toxic smoke filled the submarine, and the captain ordered the crew to surface and abandon ship. Soviet rescue ships raced to the scene, but before they arrived, the K-8 lost buoyancy and sank, taking 52 men with her, and she lies today in 15,000 feet of water, her nuclear reactors entombed on the ocean floor. And 2 years later, in 1972, the submarine K-19, known as Hiroshima among Soviet submariners because of her history of accidents, suffered yet another casualty when a fire killed 28 crew members. By the 1980s, the Cold War had entered its final decade, though no one knew it at the time, and the United States and the Soviet Union each possessed tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, and their submarine fleets prowled the oceans, continuously maintaining the balance of mutually assured destruction that prevented direct conflict. Soviet submarines had grown larger and more sophisticated, as the Typhoon-class ballistic missile submarines displaced 48,000 tons, submerged, making them larger than most World War II battleships, and each carried 20 intercontinental ballistic missiles, with each missile armed with multiple nuclear warheads, and they were the largest submarines ever built and nearly impossible to detect. American submarines hunted them relentlessly, trying to track their patrol patterns, and identify their hiding places and develop tactics to destroy them if war came, and it was a deadly game played in darkness and silence, where accidents sometimes happened with catastrophic consequences. On October 3, 1986, the Soviet ballistic missile submarine K-219 was on patrol in the Atlantic Ocean, approximately 600 miles east of Bermuda, when at 05:14 local time, a missile tube ruptured and seawater flooded into the tube, reacting with residual rocket fuel from one of the submarine's ballistic missiles, and the chemical reaction was immediate and violent as toxic gases erupted, flooding the missile compartment and killing 3 sailors within seconds. Captain Igor Britanov immediately surfaced the submarine and attempted damage control as the crew donned gas masks and fought to contain the leak. But the situation was deteriorating rapidly as the missile fuel continued reacting with seawater, generating heat and pressure, and if the fuel ignited, the resulting explosion could detonate the missile's nuclear warhead, causing a catastrophic explosion that would kill the crew instantly and send radioactive fallout across thousands of miles and potentially trigger a military confrontation between the superpowers. American naval vessels detecting the Soviet submarine in distress moved to assist, but Soviet commanders refused help suspicious of American intentions, and the K-219 crew fought alone against the disaster, threatening to destroy their vessel. Seaman Sergei Preminin, a 19-year-old sailor, volunteered to enter the flooded reactor compartment to manually shut down the nuclear reactors and prevent a meltdown, and he climbed down into the compartment, wading through waist-deep water contaminated with radiation and toxic chemicals as the heat was overwhelming and the air was poisonous. He reached the reactor controls and began the shutdown procedure, and it took nearly 30 minutes, and by the time he finished, he was severely weakened and radiation-sick and barely conscious, and he staggered back toward the ladder leading out of the compartment. But the hatch closed, and no one knows exactly what happened. As some reports suggest, the hatch mechanism jammed, while others say it was closed from above to prevent radioactive gases from spreading. Preminin was trapped, and he pounded on the hatch calling for help, but no one could open it, and he died there alone in the flooded reactor compartment, having saved the submarine and possibly prevented a nuclear disaster, and he was posthumously awarded the Order of the Red Star at age 19. The K-219 remained afloat for 3 more days as the crew struggled to keep her on the surface, pumping out flooded compartments and fighting fires, and trying to restart damaged systems, and Soviet ships arrived and attempted to take the submarine under tow. But on October 6, 1986, the K-219 lost her battle as water overwhelmed the ballast systems, and the submarine began sinking. Captain Britanov ordered the crew to abandon ship, and sailors leaped into the ocean and were pulled aboard rescue vessels as the K-219 slipped beneath the waves, descending into 18,000 feet of water, where she rests today, her nuclear reactors and missiles entombed on the ocean floor. 3 years later, in November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and the Soviet Union began collapsing as Eastern European nations declared independence, and the Communist Party lost its grip on power, and by December 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and the Cold War was over, and the nuclear standoff that had defined global politics for 45 years simply ended. Submarine patrols continued, but with less urgency and less hostility, as the threat of nuclear annihilation receded, and humanity had survived the most dangerous period in its history, but the oceans still held their secrets and their dangers. By the 1990s and 2000s, submarines had reached extraordinary levels of sophistication, as the American Virginia-class submarines introduced in 2004 incorporated stealth technologies that made them nearly undetectable, and they could launch cruise missiles and deploy special forces teams and tap undersea communications cables and conduct reconnaissance missions against hostile nations. Russian Yasen-class submarines matched them in capability, being fast and quiet and heavily armed, and China began building its own advanced submarine fleet, deploying ballistic missile submarines capable of striking targets anywhere in the Pacific, and Britain and France and India and other nations maintained their own submarine forces. At any given moment, dozens of submarines are silently patrolling beneath the world's oceans, invisible to satellites and undetectable by radar tracking potential enemies and ready to strike if ordered, and the submarine war never ended, but simply became quieter. On August 12, 2000, the Russian submarine Kursk was participating in a naval exercise in the Barents Sea, and the Kursk was an Oscar II-class guided missile submarine and one of the largest and most powerful attack submarines in the world, displacing 24,000 tons, submerged and measuring 505 feet long, and carrying a crew of 118 men. She was equipped with 24 cruise missiles, capable of destroying aircraft carriers, and she was the pride of Russia's northern fleet. But at 11:28 local time, while preparing to fire a practice torpedo, something went catastrophically wrong as an explosion ripped through the torpedo room, and seconds later a massive second explosion equivalent to 27 tons of TNT tore through the submarine's forward section, destroying the first 3 compartments. The blast was so powerful that seismologists in Norway detected it initially, mistaking it for an underwater earthquake, and the Kursk sank immediately, coming to rest on the sea floor at a depth of 350 feet. 23 men in the aft compartments survived the initial explosions and found themselves trapped in the flooded, sinking submarine, cut off from the destroyed forward sections where the control room and escape hatches were located, and they gathered in the 9th compartment and sealed the hatch. Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov, one of the officers, began writing notes documenting what had happened, and he wrote that all personnel from sections 6, 7, and 8 had moved to section 9, and there were 23 people there, and they had made this decision as a result of the accident, and none of them could get to the surface. The men waited in darkness, breathing air that grew more toxic with each passing hour, as carbon dioxide levels rose and oxygen levels dropped, and the temperature plummeted, and they waited for rescue that the Russian Navy's chaotic response would delay until it was too late. Officials initially denied that anything serious had happened and rejected offers of assistance from Norway and Britain and the United States, insisting they could handle the situation themselves, and Russian rescue submarines attempted to dock with the Kursk's escape hatches, but the hatches were damaged and the submarines couldn't establish a seal. Days passed and international pressure mounted, and finally on August 16th, 4 days after the sinking, Russia accepted foreign assistance, and British and Norwegian rescue teams arrived with advanced deep-sea diving equipment. But on August 21st, 2000, when divers finally opened the 9th compartment, all 23 men were dead. Analysis showed they had survived for several hours after the sinking, possibly longer, and they had activated emergency oxygen generators, but one of the cartridges malfunctioned, causing a fire that consumed most of the remaining oxygen and filled the compartment with toxic smoke, and they suffocated in the darkness, waiting for a rescue that came too late. Among the dead was Dmitry Kolesnikov, who had written notes documenting their final hours, and his last entry written in near total darkness, as he weakened from oxygen deprivation, read that he was writing blindly, and it seemed like there were no chances, maybe 10 to 20%. And he hoped someone would read this, and he listed the personnel from the sections who were in the 9th compartment and would attempt to get out, and he sent regards to everybody, and said, "No need to be desperate." In October 2001, an international salvage team successfully raised the Kursk from the sea floor, though the submarine's bow had been cut away, and left on the bottom too damaged to safely raise, and the bodies of 115 crew members were recovered and returned to their families for burial, while 3 bodies were never found, presumably lost in the destroyed bow section. The investigation concluded that a faulty practice torpedo had leaked hydrogen peroxide fuel, which ignited and exploded, and the initial explosion triggered the massive secondary blast when the detonations reached the torpedo warheads stored in the compartment, and it was an accident caused by aging equipment and inadequate maintenance and budget cuts that had left the Russian Navy operating with deteriorating material. Today, memorials stand in ports around the world, honoring submariners who never returned, as in Groton, Connecticut. A memorial wall lists the names of 374 American submariners killed in accidents since World War II, and in Severomorsk, Russia, a monument commemorates the crew of the Kursk, and in Portsmouth, England, plaques honor British submariners lost in training and operations. These memorials remind us that submarines, for all their technological sophistication, remain dangerous, as the ocean is vast and dark and merciless, and a single mechanical failure, or a moment of human error, or a design flaw that went unnoticed, can turn a submarine into a tomb. And once a submarine sinks beyond diving depth, rescue becomes nearly impossible. And the men aboard know this and accept it as part of the profession, but it doesn't make their deaths any easier to bear. Despite the dangers, submarines remain essential to modern naval warfare, as the United States operates approximately 70 submarines, including ballistic missile submarines that maintain nuclear deterrence, and attack submarines that hunt enemy vessels, and guided missile submarines that strike land targets with cruise missiles, and Russia maintains a fleet of nearly 60 submarines, including new Boré-class ballistic missile submarines armed with intercontinental nuclear weapons, and China has rapidly expanded its submarine fleet, now operating more than 70 vessels. But submarines also serve peaceful purposes, as research submarines explore the deepest parts of the ocean, discovering new species and mapping underwater geology, and studying climate change and ocean currents, and in 2012, filmmaker James Cameron piloted the submersible deep-sea Challenger to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, nearly 7 miles deep, becoming only the 3rd person to reach the deepest point on Earth. From John Holland's experimental submarine in 1898 to modern nuclear-powered vessels displacing 2,000 tons, the submarine has evolved from a curious experimental craft into one of the most formidable weapons systems ever developed. And over those 127 years, submarines fought in 2 world wars and conducted covert operations during the Cold War, and enforced naval blockades and launched cruise missiles and deployed special forces and gathered intelligence and maintained nuclear deterrence. They have also claimed the lives of thousands of submariners who volunteered for one of the most dangerous professions in military service and who descended into the darkness knowing they might never return. And some died in combat, torpedoed by enemy destroyers or depth-charged into oblivion, while others died in accidents from mechanical failures and fires and collisions and hull implosions, and a few simply vanished. Their submarines lost in the vast ocean, their fate unknown. We remember them all, including the crew of the USS Squalus, lost in 1939, and the sailors aboard German U-boats who fought in the most dangerous service of World War II and died at a 75% casualty rate, and the men of the USS Thresher, crushed in 8,400 feet of water in 1963, and the 99 crew members of the USS Scorpion, who lie still in the Atlantic, 2 miles deep, their final moments unknown, and Sergei Preminin, who died at 19, saving his submarine from nuclear disaster, and the 118 men aboard the Kursk, 23 of whom survived for hours in darkness, waiting for rescue that came too late, and the thousands of others named and unnamed, remembered and forgotten, who went to sea in submarines and never came home. The ocean keeps its secrets as scattered across the sea floor, from depths of a few hundred feet to abyssal trenches miles deep, lie the wrecks of submarines, and some have been found, but most never will be, and they rest in darkness, entombing the men who crewed them as silent monuments to bravery and sacrifice and the unforgiving nature of the sea. And still each day submarines submerge and begin their patrols as new crews climb down hatches and seal themselves inside steel hulls and descend into the deep. And they are volunteers, every one of them, and they know the risks, and they accept them, because someone must venture into the darkness, and someone must guard the depths, and someone must be willing to go down with the ship.